All right, get ready, because today we're tackling a question that's as mind-bending as it is timely. Can a continent have a soul? And if so, is that something Europe even needs?
It is a fascinating concept, isn't it?
It really is, and to explore it, we're going deep into a chapter from Rafael Palomino's book, featured in Law and Religion in the Liberal State.
Ah, yes, Palomino. His work always sparks interesting conversations.
Sure, this chapter is all about law, religion, and states, but then he throws in this really intriguing twist: the search for a soul for Europe.
Right off the bat, I was struck by how Palomino doesn't use soul in a purely religious way.
Yeah, he seems to be going beyond just the spiritual side of things, right?
And exactly. It's more about the essence of Europe, the driving force, what binds it together, even its unique character. It's a brilliant way to frame the challenges Europe is up against today.
That really resonates with me, because we're talking about a continent with so much history, so many cultures, and facing some pretty major issues right now.
Oh, absolutely. Brexit, populism, economic uncertainty, the list goes on.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, could a shared soul, this idea of a common essence, could that actually help Europe get through all of that?
It's a really provocative question, and I think what Palomino's arguing is that Europe needs some kind of unifying force, something that gives it direction and purpose. He uses soul to represent that.
So it's less about angels and harps and more about, like, the animating spirit of the whole continent, right?
Yeah.
What makes Europe, Europe?
Precisely. Think about things like the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the development of democracy.
Right, things that have deep roots in European thought and history.
Exactly. And Palomino actually makes a really interesting comparison. He draws a parallel to how people in medieval times viewed the soul.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Back then, the church was seen as holding the keys to the soul, and the soul was what gave life to the body of political power.
Oh, that's a really vivid image.
It is. But fast forward to today, things are obviously much more complex.
Yeah, for sure. So if it's not the church calling the shots anymore, who is? What's filling that void?
Well, Palomino argues that Europe now has this kind of secularized soul.
A secular soul, huh? What does that even mean?
It's like the spirit of law has stepped in, taking the place of religious authority. He points to institutions like the EU Court of Justice, which interprets and applies EU law as a key part of this.
Interesting. But isn't there a bit of a contradiction there? I mean, so much of European law and philosophy is rooted in Judeo-Christian ethics, right?
Yeah.
You can't really separate the two completely.
You've hit on a crucial point. Palomino highlights that tension. He talks about 3 hills that he sees as defining Europe: the Acropolis, representing philosophy, the Capitol, symbolizing law, and Golgotha, which represents Judeo-Christian ethics.
So you've got these different pillars, but it seems like there's a potential clash brewing there. Like if Europe is trying to build a secular identity, but at the same time, it can't escape those deep religious roots. How does that all play out in real life?
That is where things get really fascinating. And to understand the complexities, we need to consider another critical element that Palomino brings up. He points out that Europe's facing this demographic crisis.
Wait, a crisis? What do you mean?
Europe's on track to be the only continent that will actually lose population in the coming decades.
Seriously? Wow.
It's literally aging itself out of existence.
So going back to what Palomino said about the soul needing a body, like that medieval comparison, does this mean Europe is like running out of bodies to house its soul?
It's a stark way to put it, isn't it? But it leads to some very difficult, very real questions about immigration, about cultural change, and ultimately what it even means to be European in the 21st century.
Yeah, things are getting a lot more concrete now.
Yeah.
This isn't just abstract philosophy anymore. We're talking about people's lives, their identities, the future of a whole continent.
Exactly.
So tell me more about these challenges. How does immigration fit into all of this?
Well, some see immigration as a potential solution to that demographic decline we were talking about. Like, newcomers could be the body for this European soul, providing the people to keep Europe going.
Yeah, they can't be that simple, can it?
You're right. It's definitely not that simple. You can't just plug people into a culture and expect everything to mesh perfectly. And this is where Palomino's exploration of religion becomes really insightful, I think.
Okay, because let's be real. Europe isn't exactly a single entity when it comes to religion.
No, not at all.
You've got some countries with these strong Catholic traditions, others that are predominantly Protestant, and then there's this wave of secularism happening pretty much across the board.
You got it. And Palomino contrasts different perspectives on this, especially between Western and Eastern Europe.
Right, because those are two very different worlds in a lot of ways.
Exactly. Generally speaking, Western Europe has embraced a more secular public sphere, seeing religion as a private matter. But in Eastern Europe, religion's often more tied to national identity. It's a bigger part of the public sphere.
Okay, so how does that then impact views on immigration? I can only imagine that leads to some pretty heated debates.
You're absolutely right. This idea of large-scale immigration, especially from cultures that have different religious traditions, it raises all sorts of concerns about how cultures might shift and the potential for conflict.
It makes sense. People worry about traditional values being eroded, while others see it as a chance for their culture to be enriched.
Exactly. There are so many different viewpoints, and they all get tangled up in this question of Europe's soul. It's like, well, how can you build a shared European soul, as Palomino puts it, on something that it seems like many Europeans are actually moving away from, especially in terms of religion?
That is a really big question, and it's something we're going to delve into even deeper when we come back.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot more to unpack here.
But for now, we'll leave you with that thought.
Until next time.
See you then. Welcome back to our deep dive into the idea of a soul for Europe. Before the break, we were talking about how religion adds another layer of complexity to this whole discussion.
It really does. It's impossible to ignore the role of faith when you're talking about something as fundamental as a continent's identity.
Right. And we were just getting into how different parts of Europe view religion so differently.
Exactly. And Palomino really digs into this. He highlights this concept called the buck and furred dilemma, which sounds kind of intimidating, I know.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like something you'd hear in a philosophy lecture.
It kind of is, but it's actually pretty straightforward once you break it down.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me the layman's terms version.
All right, so think about it this way. Liberal democracies, like many in Europe, they champion things like individual freedoms.
Yeah, things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion.
Exactly. But those freedoms depend on having some level of shared values in society, a sense of right and wrong, a foundation that helps people get along and society to function.
Okay, that makes sense. You can't have a society where everyone's just doing whatever they want with no regard for anyone else.
Exactly. But here's the dilemma. If the state, the government, tries to enforce those values, to tell people what to believe,
They risk becoming authoritarian.
exactly, and that undermines the very freedoms they're supposed to be protecting.
So it's a catch-22. You need shared values to support individual freedom, but you can't force those values on people without taking away their freedom.
Precisely. And Palomino suggests that the EU's efforts to create this shared European identity often stumble into this trap. By trying to stay neutral, to avoid pushing any one set of values, they might actually be creating a new set of values by default, with secularism as the norm.
So instead of uniting people, they could actually be pushing away those who do hold strong religious beliefs.
It's a real possibility, and it gets even more complicated when you look at the historical context. Remember those 3 hills we talked about? Well, one of the most striking examples of this dilemma playing out in real life was when they left Christianity out of the EU Constitution.
Wait, they actually left Christianity out of the Constitution. Why would they do that?
The idea was that it would be more inclusive. It wouldn't favor one religion over others. But Palomino argues that this attempt at neutrality kind of backfired.
How so?
Well, by trying to be inclusive, they ended up excluding a really fundamental part of European history and identity for many people. It's like saying, your beliefs are fine, but keep them to yourself.
Which ironically could make people feel less included, not more, right?
Yeah.
Especially for those who see their faith as central to who they are.
Exactly. It's a tough balancing act. And this brings us back to the idea of Europe's secularized soul. What does that actually look like on the ground? How does it play out in society?
Well, I imagine it's a place where religion is more and more pushed into the private sphere. Laws, institutions, public discussions, they're all supposed to be neutral, free from any religious influence.
Right. But as we've been discussing, that neutrality can create its own problems. It can feel empty, like it lacks meaning, especially for people who are looking for something more than just material well-being and individual rights.
So where do we go from here? If Europe needs a soul to survive, like Palomino says, and that soul can't be purely secular or purely religious, what's the answer?
That is the million-euro question, and Palomino doesn't pretend to have easy solutions. But he does suggest that the very act of searching for a soul, of having this conversation, that in itself is a sign of hope. It shows that people care about something more than just themselves.
But how do you go from these philosophical discussions to actual, concrete solutions? How do you build a shared soul for a place as diverse and complex as Europe?
Well, Palomino argues that just setting up institutions and bureaucratic structures isn't enough. You can't force a soul into existence from the top down. It has to come from somewhere deeper.
So it needs to be more organic, something that grows from the ground up.
Exactly. And he points to some organizations that are trying to build this sense of shared identity in more subtle ways.
Like who? What kind of organizations?
Well, he mentions the Council of Europe. They're focused on things like human rights, democracy, the rule of law, but they also deal with issues like religious education and the right to conscientious objection.
So it's not just about legal frameworks and politics. It's about making space for dialogue and understanding between people with different beliefs.
Exactly. It's recognizing that a shared soul doesn't mean everyone has to believe the same things. It's about common ground, respect for differences, and a sense of belonging that goes beyond those differences.
So in a way, this whole search for a soul for Europe is really about figuring out what it means to be human in a globalized world.
That's a really insightful way to put it. It's about how we connect with each other across cultures, religions, and ideologies. And it brings us back to those challenges we discussed earlier, things like immigration and cultural change.
Right? Because those challenges aren't unique to Europe. They're happening everywhere, all over the world, as people from different backgrounds are being brought together more and more through globalization, technology, migration.
Exactly. And the question is, how do we handle these encounters? How do we create societies where people feel like they belong, even if they don't share the same beliefs or traditions?
Huge questions. And I'm guessing Palomino doesn't have all the answers.
You're right, he doesn't. But his work gives us a framework for thinking about these issues. He pushes us to go beyond simple solutions and really grapple with the complexity of building a shared identity in a world that's so diverse and constantly changing.
So what are some things he suggests? How can Europe, or any society for that matter, build this shared soul without falling into those tracks we've been talking about?
Well, he puts a lot of emphasis on shared narratives, values, and meaning. It's not enough to have laws and institutions. It's about the stories we tell, the things we hold dear, the things that give our lives meaning.
Okay, that makes sense. But what does that look like practically? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. One thing he talks about is education. He argues that education shouldn't just be about giving people knowledge and skills. It should also help them think critically, develop empathy, understand different cultures, different viewpoints.
So it's about equipping people with the tools they need to have meaningful dialogues, to really see things from other people's perspectives.
Exactly. He also highlights the importance of cultural exchange, like being exposed to different types of art, music, literature, even food. These things can help break down stereotypes and create a sense of shared humanity.
I like that. It's about connecting with each other on a human level, looking past those superficial differences that so often divide us.
And it's about understanding that having a shared identity doesn't mean erasing individual differences. In fact, embracing diversity can actually make that sense of belonging even stronger.
It's that unity and diversity idea, right?
Right.
But finding that balance, celebrating differences while fostering common ground, that's tricky.
It is. It takes constant dialogue, a willingness to listen to other perspectives, and a real commitment to finding solutions that benefit everyone.
So it's not about a one-size-fits-all approach. It's about creating a space where people can work together and build a future where everyone feels valued.
You got it. And that process, that constant conversation, is maybe the most important part of a shared soul. It's about engaging with each other, learning from each other, and working towards a world that's more just and compassionate.
That's a powerful thought. But it also makes me wonder, if this search for a soul is so important, why does it feel so hard to grasp? Why is it so hard to define, let alone achieve?
That's a great question, and Palomino grapples with that throughout his work. I think there are a few reasons why this search can feel so difficult.
Well, lay it on me. Why is it so challenging?
Well, first of all, the issues involved are just incredibly complex. We're talking about centuries of history, diverse cultures, different religions, constantly shifting demographics. There's no easy answer.
Yeah, we've been peeling back layers and layers, and it seems like there's always another layer underneath.
Right, and then there's the challenge of balancing individual freedom with a sense of collective identity. How do you create that feeling of belonging without forcing people to conform? How do you respect differences and still create a sense of shared purpose?
Those are tough questions, and the answers are probably going to be different depending on the specific context. What works in one place might not work somewhere else.
Absolutely. And then there's dealing with the past. Europe has a long history, and it's a history filled with conflict, division, even genocide. Those wounds run deep.
It makes it hard to move forward, right?
Yeah.
How do you balance that desire for unity with the need to acknowledge past injustices?
It takes a lot of care. It takes honesty, empathy, and a willingness to look at those uncomfortable truths. It also requires a commitment to justice and healing old wounds, to really addressing what caused the division in the first place.
So it's not just about looking ahead, it's about learning from what's come before. It's about understanding that the soul of a place is shaped by its history, good and bad.
Exactly. And that awareness of history is crucial if we want to understand the challenges Europe faces today, because so many of those challenges have their roots in things that haven't been resolved from the past. Religious conflict, economic inequality, the effects of colonialism.
So if we want to build a better future, we need to understand where we came from, what mistakes were made, and what we can learn from them.
Precisely. And that's what makes this search for a soul for Europe so important. It's not just a thought experiment. It's a call to action. It's about getting involved with our history, confronting our challenges, and working together to create a world that's more just and compassionate.
That's a lot to take in. But you've done a great job explaining the key ideas here. So where do we go from here? What are the next steps in the search for a soul for Europe?
Well, for me, the first step is just to keep talking about it. Keep asking these tough questions, keep challenging our assumptions, and keep looking for solutions that work for everyone.
And to remember that this isn't just a European issue. This is a global thing. We're all figuring out how to live together in a world that's becoming more and more interconnected and complicated.
That's right. And as we wrap up our deep dive into Palomino's work, it's important to remember that this search for a soul, it's not about finding the perfect answer or some grand theory that explains everything. It's about the process, the journey of learning and growing together.
So it's not about reaching a destination, it's about the journey itself.
Exactly. And that journey, that search for meaning and connection is maybe the most important part of a shared soul. It's the willingness to engage, to learn from each other, to work together to build a better world.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's realizing that we're all in this together, all trying to find a way to live meaningful lives in a world that's complex and always changing. Maybe the search for a soul isn't so much about finding answers, but about asking the right questions.
I love that. It's about curiosity. It's about that constant back and forth. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I'd really encourage our listeners to check out Palomino's book and explore these ideas themselves.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a read. It brings up some really important questions that I think we all need to be thinking about no matter where we live.
Absolutely.
So to everyone listening out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep the conversation going. We'll see you next time.
Until then, happy diving.
As we're talking about all this, one thing that struck me was how Palomino seems a bit skeptical of the EU's approach to engaging with religion.
Yeah, he's definitely critical of it. He argues that all those committees and dialogues, while maybe well-intentioned, end up feeling a bit superficial.
Like they're trying to put religion in a box, categorize it, manage it.
Exactly. And that totally misses the point of what Palomino's getting at, this deeper level of meaning and belonging that can't be captured in a bureaucratic structure.
It's almost like they're trying to control it instead of understand it.
Right. And he suggests that a more genuine engagement with religion would mean actually wrestling with those big questions that faith brings up.
You mean questions about existence, morality, our place in the universe?
Exactly. The kinds of questions that secular society often tries to shy away from.
So it's more than just tolerating different beliefs. It's about recognizing how deeply faith shapes people's lives and how they see the world. Maybe even being willing to have those hard conversations, even if there aren't easy answers.
Yes, and Palomino even argues that this kind of engagement could be a source of strength for Europe.
Really? How so?
Because at its heart, religion is about connecting to something bigger than yourself. It's about finding meaning and purpose, and that's something that a lot of people are searching for, especially in a world that can feel so chaotic and confusing.
And wouldn't that be something that could really benefit Europe right now? That sense of purpose, of connection, of belonging.
Exactly. Of course, Palomino acknowledges that this is a big, challenging task. There's no simple solution, no quick fix.
I can imagine.
It requires a lot of honesty, humility, and a willingness to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our history. But in a way, he seems to be saying that the very act of searching for a soul, of wrestling with these issues, shows that Europe is still full of life.
So it's not about finding the perfect answer. It's about embracing the journey, the messiness, the constant evolution of what it means to be European in the 21st century.
I think you put it beautifully. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, all trying to find our way in a world that's increasingly interconnected and complex. And maybe the search for a soul is less about the answers and more about asking the right questions.
I really like that. It's about staying curious, keeping the conversation going. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dives. But before we go, I want to encourage everyone listening to check out Palomino's book and really delve into these ideas for themselves.
It's a fantastic read. It'll definitely make you think. And it raises some really important questions that we all need to be wrestling with, whether we're in Europe or anywhere else in the world.
So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep the conversation going. And until next time, happy diving.